Under the Wave off Kanagawa, or the Great Wave as it's more commonly known, is perhaps the most universally recognized landscape print of all time. Arguably, no single image has enjoyed a more pervasive iconic status, one which defies borders, cultures, and time. Part of Hokusai's celebrated series, The 36 Views of Fuji, issued in the early 1830s, and which actually includes 10 additional designs published a few years later, the Great Wave has precipitated scores of scholarly articles, scientific research into colorants, Japanese production process, and even the artistic process itself. As you see here, the view of the Great Wave at the left and Mount Fuji, we in the West think the number one image is definitely the Great Wave, as you will see and hear why over time. But actually in Japan, it is Red Fuji that is the more esteemed image. To show you Hokusai's popularity and the series' popularity, just in the last few months, even the New York Times reprinted an article that they had done in August called A Picture of Change for a World in Constant Motion by Jason Farango on another design from this series. And he said, today Hokusai stands for Western audiences and in Asia too as, quote unquote, the pinnacle of Japanese art. As you can see in the Fuji at the left, the view of Fuji at the left, Fuji is very modestly portrayed in this image versus the very monumental characteristic of Fuji at the right. Just this month, I received my copy of the Andon Journal for the Society of Japanese Art in the Netherlands. And in there, an article by Capucine Cronenberg focuses on the numerous facsimile versions of the Great Wave that exist in museums, particularly in Eastern Europe, that are in need of cataloging and connoisseurship evaluation. The popularity of this image has been pervasive, and I wanted to show you when I first started being interested in Japanese art when I was an undergrad. This series of postage stamps at the right from 1974 was done for a letter writing for the Postal Union, and it included 8 internationally well-known artists. And you will see Hokusai is represented by a detail of a painting, and is the only non-Western artist, and of course, the only one who is from Asia at all. But I would argue that even at that point in time in 1974, he was iconic as an artist within the world stature, the global stature of world art. And then on the left, you have a fairly recent 2015 postage stamp of an impression of the Great Wave issued in France from an impression that exists in France. So even in France, even in America, the name Hokusai is something of global repute. Next slide. But this imagery didn't come out of nowhere, as we will hear from some of our speakers. And since I myself am a passionate lover of surimono, I thought I would show you 2 images by 2 of Hokusai's pupils, Hokkei and Gakute, which show those same kind of images, but were actually done a decade before the series that the Great Wave is part of, the 36 Views. And dare I even argue that in the world of Japanese clay, my other passion, the imagery of a wave and a crashing wave becomes pervasive in 3 dimensions by artists living and working in Japan today. I'm not sure they would agree with me that that's their source of inspiration, but I think the imagery is so iconic and so pervasive and so ingrained in the subconscious, it's hard to determine where the actual influence comes from. So where did the idea for this symposium, this panel, come about? And it started with a conversation that I had with Gary Levine, one of our participants, after an auction that took place at Christie's here in New York. And the image that you see here is of the impression of the Great Wave that brought over $1.1 million. This is a world record for a Japanese print publicly traded. And it caused both Gary and me to start to reflect, okay, why did this impression bring so much money? Why is this such a image that's in such hot demand on a global stage, when in fact, it's not particularly rare? So we said, oh, let's do a panel discussion. So, okay, who are we going to put on the A team for this discussion? And first, we went to Sarah, knowing that the MFA Boston has such a wide collection of Hokusai material, and that in fact Sarah is a distinguished author on the subject. And she suggested including Michiko Adachi, who has actually worked on the Great Wave impressions that are in the collection of the museum. And of course, we had to have Christine Guth, who is the author of Hokusai's Great Wave publication. She was critical to join our band today. And finally, over a drink with Matthew McKelway, who is currently professor of Japanese art at Columbia, and we were starting to talk about other types of wave imagery that predate Hokusai. He very kindly agreed to participate with this group of scholars and passionate lovers of Japanese art. So today we have about 350 screens actually here. We're completely sold out with 500 people originally booked. And I would argue that that is a testament to the power and reputation of Hokusai and this unforgettable image. And I would argue also the erudition of our really quite fantastic panel. On our list of guests, we have 36 curators from 35 museums around the world, 5 appraisers, quite a number of museum conservators, 7 print collectors whose collections have traveled to Japan and been published and lent and donated to institutions around the world. We have 17 academicians from 15 American universities, many dealers specializing in Japanese prints. At least 25 states are represented in the audience, and people from 10 countries that include Japan, Russia, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, Singapore, South Africa, and Poland. So I must, to those of you who are waking up to join us tonight, I wish you good morning, and I hope you can stay awake as we get started on our panel. Before introducing our panelists specifically, I must also thank Margaret Tao, the director of Asia Week, and Catherine Martin, its current chairperson, for their support of this program. We are all learning and adapting to the ever-changing technical challenges of Zoom, as we saw tonight, and working together to create a robust audience for Asian art collecting and education. We all look forward to new virtual formats, and we will be presenting those for Asia Week this March, since very few of us will be able to travel to New York. So, to introduce our speakers, I'd like to start with Michiko Adachi. Michiko-san is currently the assistant conservator for flat works of art on paper in the Asian Conservation Studio. She received her MA in conservation from SUNY Buffalo, where she completed her internship at the Library of Congress. She was the Sherman Fairchild Fellow at the MFA Boston before becoming assistant conservator in 2019. She was responsible for the care and preservation of works of art on paper in the Asian collection, which includes Islamic and South Asian paintings and manuscripts, and their enormous collection of Japanese woodblock prints and books. Christine Guth led the Asian Specialism group in the Victorian Albert Museum and Royal College of Art's History of Design program from 2017 until 2016. She has written widely about aspects of the history of collecting, transnational cultural exchange, and material culture, particularly in relation to Japan. Her book-length publications include Art, Tea and Industry, Matsuda Takashi and the Mitsui Circle from 1993, Longfellow's Tattoos, Tourism, Collecting in Japan from 2004, and Hokusai's Great Wave, Biography of a Global Icon from 2015. Her book, Craft Culture in Early Modern Japan, Materials, Makers, and Mastery, is forthcoming from the University of California Press in September 2021. Gary Levine, our third panelist, is a native New Yorker, and after graduating from the Cooper Union, was briefly employed by an Asian art gallery in New York City. Immediately after leaving the gallery, he started working as a private dealer in New York, specializes in Japanese woodblock prints. Over the past 45 years, Gary has served as a consultant on ukiyo-e for Phillips, Sotheby's, and Bonham's auction houses. He has lectured extensively to appraisal groups, academic institutions, as well as to collecting organizations. He continues to do acquisitional consulting work for American museums, libraries, and focus collectors for whom he tries to maintain the highest standards of professionalism. Matthew McKelway is the Takeo Itsuko Atsumi Professor of Japanese Art History at Columbia, where he also serves as the director of the Mary Griggs Burke Center for Japanese Art. He has been a visiting professor at the Free University of Berlin, the University of Heidelberg, Seijo University, and the Université Paris Panthéon Sorbonne. His publications include Capitalscapes, Folding Screens and Political Imagination in Medieval Kyoto from 2006, Traditions Unbound, Groundbreaking Painters from the 18th Century Kyoto, the Asian Art Museum in 2005, Silver Wind, The Arts of Sakai Hoitsu from Japan Society and Yale University Press of 2012, Rosetsu, Ferocious Brush for the Rietberg Museum and Prestel in 2018, and countless articles in Japanese, English, and in French. In 2017, he was awarded the Lenfest Distinguished Faculty Award. And last, but certainly not least, Sarah Thompson, one of my fellow students from Columbia from a million years ago, is one of several curators of Japanese art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, who specializes in Japanese prints. She received her PhD in Japanese art from Columbia and taught Japanese and Asian art history at Vassar College, Oberlin College, and the University of Oregon before she moved to the MFA in 2004. From 2005 to 2010, as part of the Japanese Print Access and Documentation Project, she created a digital catalog of the MFA's collection of over 50,000 Japanese prints, the largest collection outside Japan. She has curated numerous exhibitions at the MFA and elsewhere, including a major Hokusai retrospective at the MFA in 2015, and she has published 3 books herself on Hokusai's work. So that's our lineup, and I would like to start questions, and my first question will be to Sarah. Sarah, before we start delving into the celebrated print, I think it would be wonderful if you could introduce us to the world-renowned artist and this most popular series of printed landscape images, probably the most popular series ever created. It would be ideal if you could also illustrate for us how this series stands apart from other ukiyo-e of the time and from other works within Hokusai's oeuvre.
Okay, thank you, Joan. I do actually want to talk just a little bit about the specific print because I want to make sure that from the beginning, everybody knows what's going on in it. Now, as you pointed out, the actual title is Under the Wave off Kanagawa. That's written in the box at the upper left. And Kanagawa is the name of the area that is just south of the big city that we know as Tokyo and Hokusai knew as Edo. The city was so large already in Hokusai's time that the fishing area close to it was not enough to supply the demands of the fish markets. And so they drew on fishing all around what we know today as Tokyo Bay. Kanagawa today is Kanagawa Prefecture. It's where Yokohama is located. And so that star on the map is approximately where I think these events are taking place. Now, Mount Fuji is west and a little bit south of the city. So given the direction in which the boats are going and the direction in which you see Mount Fuji, they're moving south, they're moving away from the city. Those are not actually fishing boats. What they are is express fish delivery boats that would pick up the catch from the various fishing grounds and then row it as quickly as possible to get it to the markets while the fish was still in good shape. So that's why you see the banks of rowers on those boats. They're rowing rather than sailing for speed. However, they're going south away from the city. I have always assumed that they made the delivery and are going home. But Tim Clark, in his book on the Great Wave, thinks that they are actually setting out to pick up the catch, and then they'll turn around and take it back into the city. Now, that's assuming that they make it. Not quite ready, almost, but not quite. That's assuming that they make it because they've run into this dangerous situation. But I think they're going to be all right. They're doing the right thing, which is going straight at the wave. And with luck, they will be able to shoot through it and come out safely on the other side. So now we get to your actual question. This is part of that very famous series, the 36 Views of Mount Fuji. Back in my teaching days, one of my favorite trick questions was, how many prints are there in Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji? As you know, the answer is 46, because it was such a huge best-selling success that he made 10 additional designs in addition to the 36 that were originally planned. There's been a lot of scholarly debate as to exactly when the series was made. The prints are not dated, but from many different kinds of evidence, it looks as if probably the publication started in 1830 and went on for several more years after that. There are also a lot of questions about the order in which the prints were issued. The Great Wave was probably fairly early in the series, but not in the very first group. Whose idea was it? Could have been Hokusai, could have been the publisher, we don't know. How many of them were made? Again, they weren't numbered, we don't know. They made as many as they thought they could sell. And in this case, probably until the blocks were just completely useless. So at a guess, somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000. How many of those have survived? Again, at a guess, probably about 200. And Andreas Marx of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts has a book coming out soon on his studies of the series. And by looking at all the published examples, either in books or online, he found 112 examples of the Great Wave. Of course, there are more, either in private collections or in museum collections that just haven't been published yet. Hey, let's go on. What was different about these? This series is what made landscape a big subject in ukiyo-e prints. It had always been a small, minor subject from the beginning, but not anywhere near as popular as prints of kabuki actors and beautiful women in high fashion kimono. Those were the two main things until about 1830, when suddenly landscape was up there with those because of Hokusai's series. Here are a couple of early examples. That's a hand-painted example on the left by Kiyomasa II. You can see in a very traditional Asian landscape style. And then something new came in about the 1740s. That was the perspective prints, the ukie, that utilized a deliberately extreme version of Western vanishing point perspective. So here's one by Toyoharu, who was quite famous for them, made in the 1770s when Hokusai was a teenager. So he would have been familiar with that way of looking at things from a very young age. And in fact, he himself, as a young artist in the 1780s, 90s, did a number of these perspective prints himself. So he became very familiar with that. Okay, on to the next slide. As we get into the 1780s, we begin to see some very beautiful landscapes in ukiyo-e prints, such as the triptych by Kiyonaga showing the island of Enoshima at the top there. But still, these landscapes, even though they're very, very nice, are just background. It's not the main subject, it's background for the human figures that are the main focus of the print. So the Enoshima example there by Kiyonaga, who was famous for his elongated, beautiful women. And not too long after that, from 1797 at the lower left, an album picture from a poetry album by Hokusai himself, also showing Enoshima. And you'll notice a suspiciously familiar shape of wave there. I'll get to in a moment. But again, it's the figures that are the main focus. The landscape is just the background. And it's not until roughly about 1830 with the Fuji series that all of a sudden he really begins to focus on the landscape and make it the background. So that once again is the island of Enoshima from a slightly different angle. And this time in the Fuji series, he showed it at low tide with the sandbar that you can walk on out to the island. Okay, next. Next slide. There we go. All right. Now, once again, there is Hokusai's album painting of 1797 with one of the ancestors of the Great Wave. And that was almost certainly inspired by something that he would have had the opportunity to see a year earlier in 1796, when this imitation of a Western style painting by Shiba Kokan, one of the pioneers of Western style art in Japan, was exhibited in Edo. The painting today is in the Kobe City Museum, done with opaque pigments to kind of try and look like oil painting. So it's the same composition that Hokusai used, although the wave is quite a small one there, and Hokusai, who liked to do water, made it a little bit bigger. Then moving on into the early 1800s, Hokusai did some small landscapes imitating a Western style prints. He even, in this small one that you see at the lower left, even wrote his signature sideways to make it look like exotic Western writing. In those strange foreign countries, they write the wrong way. They write horizontally instead of vertically like normal people. So there's the horizontal signature. And once again, you see a wave. This one has beautiful embossing. Now, in that case, the landscape really is the signature, is the main subject. That is totally a landscape print, but it is a miniature one. It wasn't until later on that he did full-size Olban, about 10 by 15 inch prints. However, interestingly enough, there was an artist other than Hokusai that was a kind of predecessor, and that was one of his own pupils, an artist named Hokuju, who was obviously very good. We don't know much about him. He died in 1824. So he was just a few years younger than Hokusai, but Hokusai outlived him by quite a lot. Of course, Hokusai outlived almost everyone by quite a lot. But here are two very lovely full-size landscapes by Hokuju. So it was a kind of an attempt to push the boundaries of ukiyo-e, do some new subject matter. However, although these were successful, they were not huge bestsellers. And so although landscape was an acceptable subject, it still wasn't a major, hugely popular one. There is one possible reason for that, that has to do with the colors that were used for these color prints. And if you look at the blue colors of the water, on the left, once again, one of those suspicious Enoshima waves, the blue is a little bit gray. That is probably indigo. In the print on the right, there's a very beautiful clear blue. We haven't actually tested it, so I can't say for sure, but it looks as if it's probably dayflower blue, the vegetable color that's very common in 18th century prints. It's a lovely color, but it fades very, very quickly. It's very rare to find it unfaded. So the lack of really satisfactory blues may have been one reason why landscape prints did not become a huge hit at this time, but that all changed in 1830 or thereabouts with Hokusai's Fuji series. Okay, now could we have these? Here they are. All right. These wonderful prints, they rely heavily on something new in ukiyo-e, and that was an imported pigment known as Prussian blue, which, as its name suggests, was indeed imported from Europe. It was known in Japan as Berlin blue. It's a synthetic color. It had actually been known since the 18th century, but it was expensive. But in the very late 1820s, the price went down and it became practical to use it in prints. There was a huge fad for prints done in shades of blue. And it seems that the 36 Views of Mount Fuji series actually, at the very beginning, was supposed to be an all blue series, these beautiful things printed in shades of blue. So the very earliest group of prints in the series, one of which you see on the left, were actually done totally in shades of blue. It's a mix of Prussian blue and indigo. Indigo is used for the outlines. Instead of the usual black outlines, they actually are dark blue, done with indigo. And then, for example, in the wave, Prussian blue is used for the different colors of the water. The wave is from what's probably the second group, in which there are a few colors now being used in addition to the blue, but it's still very, very important. The blue is still the main color. Then gradually, the fad for blue died down. By the time we get to the end of the series, it's one of many colors. And in fact, for those last 10 prints that were added on as extras, they went back to using black outlines once again. And also used black outlines for some of the later reprints of even the early designs. So you can find late printings of the wave that do have black outlines. So on to more study of the different versions.
Now turn our attention to Matthew, who is the Japanese painting historian in our band. And I would like to ask Matthew if he would illuminate for us some of the historical context and the art historical precedents for the imagery in the Great Wave. Where did this design come from?
Sure, Joan, thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for that wonderfully illuminating introduction to the Great Wave by Hokusai and its immediate antecedents. I'm going to take us much further back in history, a history of East Asian painting in general, and begin with a few paintings from China. I'm not a historian of Chinese art, but like most of us who study Japanese art at the graduate level, began studying Chinese art already as an undergraduate. And one of the key, I guess there are two main issues or features of Hokusai's Great Wave that I'd like to just touch on right now at the beginning before we go on. And the first of those is the particular form of his wave, those finger-like protrusions or finger-like extensions from the cresting wave itself. The other feature, I'll just reiterate from what Sarah was saying, is the color. And I think we'll see some interesting relationships amongst the works that we'll start to look at now. So the first group that I thought I would touch on is a group of a dozen or so images, all the same size. They appear to be basically the size of an album leaf, but they're mounted on a hand scroll today, kept in the Palace Museum in Beijing. And I imagine most of us have probably not had a chance to view this because it's only on view in Beijing very occasionally. It's so fragile. It's a scroll painted by the great academic painter Ma Yuan of the Southern Song Dynasty. You can see his dates there. I'll just add here that each of these images has a title inscription brushed by Empress Yang Meizi, a very important cultural figure of the Southern Song and the subject of important studies by Huishu Li, among others. She's a professor at the University of California at Los Angeles. The hand scroll consists of 12 sections, and we begin with Light Breeze at Lake Dongting, referencing a very famous place in China. Lake Dongting, of course, is one of the 8 views of Xiaolanxiang. If we can continue to the next slide, perhaps, we'll see another image in which Ma Yuan, in this group of water studies, as it's called today, shows us a very different kind of behavior of the aquatic environment in this range upon range of ripples and waves. you can begin to see some of the pattern-like quality that will eventually find its way into Hokusai's work. Perhaps the next image showing us a view called Clouds Unfurling and Waves Roiling Up shows us something even closer, perhaps, to Hokusai's image. And so what these, and there are many more, I just have these to show you, but what these begin to show us, I think, is a kind of, it gives us insight into the Southern Song dynasty's general cultural, if we could say, interest in phenomenology, in natural phenomena and effects, in a way that Ma Yuan here creates these images not based on any particular observation, but really as a way to show this bravura brushwork. And the waves really start to become something else. They take on a kind of zoomorphic quality, we might say, that is, I think, really effectively presages what we'll see in Hokusai. Next, please. I have a couple of images more. I just want you to focus here on the single screen painting, this freestanding screen painting on the right of this image by the Southern Song painter Su-Han Chen. This is an image in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, called Lady at Her Dressing Table in a Garden. I'm sorry, I don't have the MFA credited here, but it is from the MFA. And this is a work that I first became aware of, like the next one we can look at, Man Sleeping on a Bamboo Couch, from the Yuan to Ming Dynasty. The date's not entirely clear. This work in the Metropolitan Museum, also featuring a screen painting. I became aware of this, became aware of these in the work of Wu Hong, the professor of Chinese art history at the University of Chicago, who wrote a wonderful book called The Double Screen, a book about medium and material in Chinese art. And he focuses on these screen paintings, these images, pictures within a picture, to talk about the subject of water and waves on screen paintings as something that may allude to the psychological state of the sitter. In this case, this man is fast asleep, maybe dreaming of the sea. In the previous image, the woman in front of the mirror, who's looking at herself in the mirror before the screen painting may allude to her own psychological state. I'm not sure if I completely agree with that thesis, but I think it's an interesting and provocative one. But I bring these out also just to show us examples of images on screen paintings of waves already in China. Now, none of these screen paintings themselves survive. We have no extant freestanding or folding screen paintings from China before the Qing dynasty, I think. But we have many examples of them as paintings within paintings, such as the next example. We can look at a painting by Du Jin. Here's the overall image, an image of a gentleman enjoying antiquities. He's appreciating and I guess admiring his collection of bronzes and ceramics and so forth. And behind him, if we can look at the close-up in the next image, is another freestanding screen, in this case, of rough waves once again. So this is yet another image that shows us perhaps that this was, we might say, popular subject or common subject of mural images of large-scale pictures in China in the pre-modern period. And then one more image from China, I think, is next. This is a wonderful scroll called The North Sea by the Ming Dynasty painter Zhou Chen, a professional painter, I think, active in Suzhou. This work is in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. And the drama in the picture really begins, I think, at the right, if we have a close-up next, of these rough, almost sort of octopus-like waves with their sort of tentacles that take on a quality that seems to have less to do with water and maybe more to do with some other kind of substance. But again, I think we can see how these are all part of a tradition, the examples of which we first see in the work of Ma Yuan that I showed at the beginning. Our next image takes us into Japan. This is a work that I believe dates from the 17th century, late 17th century, called Rough Waves. It belongs to the Tokyo Fuji Art Museum in the outskirts, the western suburbs of the metropolis. It's an 8-panel folding screen, so it folds, gilded, and on top of which are painted in ink, I think some azurite blue, and a shell-based white pigment, rough waves once again. But here, waves themselves are the subject matter. And I think this may be one of the very earliest examples in Japan of a screen painting that takes waves as the subject. Now, of course, there are other major examples of paintings with great waves in them, such as the famous Matsushima or Pine Island screens by Tawaraya Sotatsu in the Freer Gallery in Washington, and as well as paintings of dragons in which waves prominently appear because dragons are believed to be bringers of rain and emerging from the sea. But this is the earliest example that I'm aware of that takes waves as the sole subject matter. A more dramatic example even than this is our next image. We're quite lucky to have this right here in New York City. It's occasionally on view. Ogata Korin, the great painter of the Genroku period, a 2-panel screen called Rough Waves, in which he also takes waves as his subject matter. And I think as we look at this, we can see that there's some interesting interaction between the larger wave that threatens to fall on the smaller wave beneath, which seems to recoil in almost a kind of animal-like way. You can start to see some bird heads and things like that. Part of the power of this image, as I found when I was researching it a number of years ago, is that Korin uses a very particular technique in painting these waves, and that is that he uses a double brush. He takes 2 brushes and paints so that he creates perfectly parallel strokes in this image, and that adds a certain kinetic quality, a kind of vibrancy, we might say, to these very active waves. He also adds blue, but I think it's interesting to see that the blue outlines, it sort of creates contours or fills in negative space around the waves rather than coloring them in, which I think creates an interesting connection or distinction from Hokusai a bit later. The next work, a pair of folding screens by the great Sakai Hoitsu, the painter who really I think we could credit for having preserved the memory of Korin for posterity. This work was Hoitsu created in reaction to the single 2-panel screen by Korin that we just looked at. We know from a letter by Hoitsu that he saw the painting now in the Metropolitan Museum, the 2-panel gold screen of waves, and he changed the circumstances of one of his commissions. He was actually commissioned to paint a pair of screens for a client on the subject of birds and flowers, a very common, rather it's a commonplace East Asian picture subject. But because he was so excited by the painting by Korin that he had just seen, he decided to, in a sense, to try to outdo Korin, if that's possible, by instead of gold, using a pair of screens that were sheathed in silver leaf and expanding the visual field from the 2-panel screen, single 2-panel screen, to a pair of 6-panel screens, as we can see. So there's certainly echoes of Korin's work in this painting. There's one more image that I have to show. Here's a detail, I guess, of the right screen of the pair. Thanks, I think we can go on. This would be my last image, which is we could say, a work that functions as part of a big self-advertisement on Hoitsu's part. He publishes a manual, kind of picture book of images that he thinks are probably the ones that should be most closely associated with him as an artist in 1817. This book is called Oson Gafu, or the painting picture manual of Oson. Oson is a name that Hoitsu used. And he hires Kamo Suetaka, who's a great literary figure of the time, a great intellectual, to sort of crown it with a preface, a very intellectual preface at the beginning. And he has it published by an Edo publisher named Izumiya Shojiro. And one of the, it's not a very big book, but one of the images that he includes is an image of a single cresting wave, as you can see here, printed in a way that seems to suggest his use of a double brush as well, a kind of homage to Corinne. And also printed in a way also that does not include any color. This is only, the colors included are basically just shades of gray. I find this interesting because it's dated to 1817. The form of the wave, this is a book that circulated in Edo. We know that Hoitsu and Hokusai lived fairly close to one another. I have not seen any evidence that they actually knew each other or interacted. They were members of different social status groups. And so I imagine that Hoitsu probably was not interested in interacting with someone as a lowly craftsman like Hokusai, I guess. But they were almost exactly the same age. I think Hoitsu is a year younger than Hokusai. I find this an interesting image to contemplate in the context of Hokusai's Great Wave, and maybe to see it as one of the images perhaps that Hokusai may himself have seen. Again, color is absent from this image. Hokusai finishes it off by using the Prussian blue, as Sarah so beautifully stated earlier. Thank you very much. That's I think those are all the images I have.
Thank you, Matthew. That was illuminating and exciting. And I think we have lots of food for thought and further research. Certainly the Oson Gafu had a profound impact on many Surimono artists in the Hokusai group. And we have many examples of, I wouldn't say plagiarism, but points of inspiration taken from the seminal book. But it was great to see some of these Chinese prototypes that I'm totally unaware of wave screens in the background. It was very, very fascinating. Thank you. That's terrific. Christine, I hope you're still with us. We haven't lost you. Great. Let's turn our attention to the environment in which this iconic image was made. The Great Wave emerged from such a rich artistic background, and its composition had immediate impact, not only in Japan, but on artists abroad. A remarkably robust influence that continues to this day. And as the author of Hokusai's Great Wave biography of a global icon, can you tell us a few of the highlights from your fascinating research? In particular, we would all love to hear your viewpoint as to what is it that makes this image so iconic and accessible to cultures across the globe through the centuries.
Well, thank you, Joan. It's really hard to encapsulate the many reasons for this image's iconicity, precisely because there are so many. But let me single out perhaps three that I think stand out, to me at least. And I think I should also point out to start with that the reception of this image is very much dependent on who you are, where you are, and when you lived, because the reception of the image has changed dramatically over time. But I think that it's fair to say that one reason for its iconicity is the composition's sheer visual power. Although Under the Wave of Kanagawa, to give it its proper title, was conceived as part of a series celebrating Mount Fuji, it is in fact the towering wave in the foreground that first grabs your attention. And it grabs your attention and holds it. But more than that, and punning aside, I think this image is incredibly immersive. It makes you feel as if you are actually in the water. So it creates a kind of intimacy that is rather extraordinary. While the wave speaks to the awesome forces of nature, the boats cutting through the wave add a kind of human dimension to the drama. And this combination of elements, both nature and human, I think gives the print kind of universal resonance. And what I mean by that is that the print's appreciation doesn't really require any specialized knowledge. You don't have to know anything about Japan to appreciate appreciate this. A second factor that's contributed to this print's iconicity is the medium itself. And I think that has to be really emphasized. There are many works of art that we talk about as being iconic today, but most of them are unique works of art, like the Mona Lisa. This is not a unique painting. This is a woodblock printed multiple, one that had very wide circulation during Hokusai's lifetime. As Sarah Thompson mentioned earlier, they're thought to have been somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 impressions of it. And there are as many as 200 surviving in collections around the world, but particularly in the United States and Europe today. And the multiplicity of the print is a major factor in its gaining celebrity, because it was circulating very widely within Japan during Hokusai's lifetime and also later. But I think related to multiplicity is the many variations of the print that began with Hokusai's own. In addition to the print with its distinctive blue coloring, Hokusai created another wave in his 100 views of Mount Fuji. And although it doesn't have the striking palette, it is nonetheless a very, very dramatic image, and one that's much closer to the other versions that Matthew was showing us a little bit a moment ago, with a kind of claw-like extensions. But what's distinctive about this version in the book is that Hokusai reverses the direction to reflect the right to left reading of a Japanese book. In addition to Hokusai, there were many artists of his generation and later who picked up this subject. And the fact that an artist such as Hiroshige picked it up is one indication that this was already a very popular image in the 19th century in Japan. I think that this image, probably more than the more famous horizontal view of the Great Wave by Hokusai that we're focusing on today, I think that this image was probably much more influential in Europe, because it was issued in 1858 after Japan was opened up, and it was circulating in far greater numbers in Europe than Hokusai's. And if you trace the many adaptations of the Great Wave in Europe, including this plate that was issued by Royal Copenhagen in 1885, I think you can see more clearly the influence of this later print rather than Hokusai's. But all of this speaks to the multiplicity and the circulation of these images and the influence of that very process. The last point I want to raise is the sheer communicative power of Hokusai's wave as a graphic design. It can be reduced to its absolutely barest contours, and you still recognize it. And this is a perfect example. Here, the creamy filling of an Oreo cookie has been shaped, and no one would mistake it. Everybody immediately would recognize it. And
Fantastic.
Very much a brand-like, a logo-like quality that makes it very easily adapted to all kinds of purposes. And some of which I will show you a little bit later on. But to really reiterate, I think as a graphic design, as a very simple graphic design with enormous power, this image has almost no match.
Thank you, Christine. That was wonderful. And I think as we, the audience, are enjoying this travelogue, if you will, through the history of Japanese painting and prints, as we get to this Oreo cookie, yes, indeed, it still has an incredible impact. It's quite different than the Hoitsu screens that we saw before, or the Korean, and you have identified that for us perfectly. My next question is to Michiko. We've now heard about the history and the impact of this image, but Michiko, can you tell us more about what we're seeing in these prints in material terms? What are the technical aspects that you can illuminate for us especially with respect to pigment and color?
Yes, so in Japanese woodblock prints, both inorganic, so mineral-based pigments, and organic, plant dye-based colorants are used to print on Japanese hosho paper. Today, I wanted to use the great wave from the Minneapolis Institute of Art to talk more about the color, since the colors in these are clear to see and appear to be well preserved. And as you can see, the Great Wave actually has a relatively simple palette, which I think is true for the other prints in the series as well. There are the blues that you see in the key block and the wave, the yellow in the boats, the dark and light gray in the sky and boat, and finally, the pink in the sky. Now let's take a closer look. Here's a close-up of the blue. As you can see, we have 4 different blues: the outline or key block, the dark blue and medium tone blue, which are the stripes you see in the wave, and then the light blue at the crest of the wave. I hope you can see, but the outline is a dullish blue, which is said to be indigo. The dark blue is also part of the key block, so it would have been printed at the same time in indigo. But then the medium tone blue, which is Prussian blue, is printed over the whole area, making the dark blue a combination of indigo and Prussian blue. The light blue, just as the medium tone blue, is also Prussian blue. And this is what was so revolutionary about this synthetic colorant, Prussian blue. Not only was it a saturated blue, due to the small particle size, you could get a dark blue to a very light blue, depending on concentration. And I suppose that's the reason the series has a more simple palette, is because they wanted the Prussian blue, which was new to colors, a new color to prints at the time, to take center stage. Here is the yellow in the boat. It's probably orpiment, which is an arsenic sulfide mineral pigment, commonly used across time and location. I assume it has faded, but it's hard to tell how much more brighter this yellow originally would have been. Next is the gray. There's the darker gray on the boat and the sky near Mount Fuji, which transitions into a light gray up to the top of the print. This is most likely carbon black or sumi, the black that you see in ink paintings and calligraphy. And this technique of creating a gradation is called bokashi. It is created on the block by hand by the printer, so it's different every time. Sometimes it's a subtle difference, as printers were probably used to recreating the same print, but it can also differ quite a lot. It could possibly mean it's a different edition, or possibly a different printer, or even maybe just a different day. I don't know, but this is one of the printing techniques that makes each Japanese print more unique than a simple multiple. And finally, the pink sky. I think a lot of people don't realize the Great Wave has this pink sky. I certainly only realized after interning at the MFA while I was a graduate student. Here in this print, you can still get a sense of the pink sky. It's most likely a red organic colorant that is also probably faded, but like the boat, it's hard to tell how much pinker or brighter the sky would have been. I think this pink sky is interesting because it gives the Great Wave more context as to the time of day, probably dawn or dusk, which can be lost in other impressions. One last color I should mention is white. It's not printed, so a colorant wasn't used to create it, but it's the tone of the paper, which the artists used effectively in their designs. Thank you.
Thank you, Michiko. Actually, so much of what you just said was not known when I was a graduate student. It's amazing how much more information there is as to the materials with which these prints are made, which gives us new insight into how the artists and the printers perhaps were working together. That was very illuminating. I'd now like to turn to Gary Levine, the dealer amongst us. And as a long experienced dealer and connoisseur of Japanese prints, Gary, can you explain and show us some typical examples of intervention, conservation, and enhancement, and how and where we should look for them? Tell us about some of the clues you have discovered that reveal telltale block breaks, color, cloud variations, and other aberrations that are unique to impressions of this most coveted design.
Okay, so we have here a print that is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So often with Japanese prints, what you're looking at is not what came off of the block originally. We see things that happened afterwards, after these things were printed, many times within the 20th century, early, mid, later 20th century. This particular print, and what we're going to talk about in this small little time allotment, the things I'm talking about also apply to many of the Japanese prints, famous Ohashi Bridge, Shono, Kambara, a lot of these, what we'll call maybe like problems. But we're just going to focus in on the Great Wave. So this impression from the Met, it's probably the most published one that's been around. It's been on calendars, it's in reference books. If you Google Great Wave through Wikipedia, this is the one that comes up. And that August 7th article in the New York Times, this is the one that they used. Now it's very attractive. Actually, the impression is a very good impression. But one thing that stands out is, if you notice, we had seen a number of great waves already. They had a light yellow boat. Unfortunately, somebody took it upon themselves to retouch the boats, where they thought liked it better. It was more attractive, but it's painted in. Somebody had taken watercolors. We don't know who, and we don't know exactly when, but this was, the Met has had this for many, many, many years. So it happened many years ago. But they just took it upon themselves to what they thought was improving the design. Of course, Hokusai and the publishers had no intent on this. It is a beautiful impression, but another thing that especially we see on this print is there's usually a break on the cartouche. If we look on the left part of the print on the cartouche that's circled, in that area, there's usually a break. And if we were to look very closely, you can see with a very fine single brush technique that someone has put those two little lines in very, very carefully. And also where this other circle is, many times there's a break there. And if you look very carefully, you can see the line is a little thinner than the key block. Now I had the opportunity, and you can too if you're in New York, this print is on display right now at the Met in their 150-year anniversary exhibition. So you can really take a good look. This is their high-res photograph of it. I had taken my cell phone pictures of it and really focused in. I was able to get very, very close to it. So that's interesting about that print. Now, this image is also from the Met. And this, in terms of scholarship and other people looking at it, might be, you can't quintessentially say the best impression, but clearly one of the top impressions. The one in Minneapolis is really, really very good as well. We look at the, one of the ways we tell of course, the crispness of the printing, but the bokashi around Fuji is a very telltale point about earliness in printing. It's very soft and very beautifully softly printed. Also at the top of the Fuji, you can still see the opening, the mouth of Fuji, which disappeared a little later on. Now I think we have a close-up of the next little, there we go. So if we zoom in on this print, which is a really, really great impression, and if we look really closely at this print, you can see where that break is, that the lines are a little teeny bit smaller. So even on a print very early, it's been touched in, which they did. It's hard to see ones that, might not be. There are possibilities that ones that are out there don't have this touching in, but I haven't seen any really yet. Okay, this is an interesting situation. We talk about printing. This print, both where it's circled and that triangle, if you look very closely, I actually, this was sold at auction in New York, a number about, I think in 2018 at Christie's. Unfortunately, the yellow has been touched in. It's very bright yellow. If we noticed at some of the other great waves, the original color is a very light colored yellow. Okay. So this has somebody, instead of making it red, they just made it a stronger yellow because they thought, oh, this looks better. And also those breaks have also been touched in. And if we pause just for a second on the breaks and touching in part, in the center, there's a little oval circle, and that circles a little area where I always called a bat, or it's a backwards 3. And that was one of the little quintessential little secrets I always look for to see if the great wave is real or not. Again, everything that we talk about, there's always exceptions to the rule. And I think we might have a little exception a little later on in the picture, but usually if it has this deformed kind of bubble, that's a good sign, and it usually is real. But this print, even though it was touched in at auction, it went for close to $500,000. And the next slide. Okay, so this slide is also from the Met. I think the Met has 5 or 6 great waves, and it has the light yellow. We see on the wave that's still unbroken, has not been touched in. But if you were to look closely at this print, the cartouche break is there. But the interesting thing about this print is the cloud. If you started comparing the lines of the cloud with some of the other ones we looked previously at really nice great waves, this cloud doesn't match up. That cloud is a very fugitive color. So when we see it at all, that's a very good sign, and it's a valuable, being a dealer, it's a very good thing. But this has been added probably in the mid to early 20th century. There were people that were told to me many, many years ago by a mentor of mine, Matsushita-san, and he'd been a long-time dealer, and Japanese prints have been in his family for a very, very long time. So he had many, many, many wonderful insights. And it was like common knowledge that many of the dealers at the time had cloud blocks that when they faded out, they just took the great wave and printed in a new set of clouds. So that's something to always keep your eye on when you see a cloud that is in existence. The other cloud of the early 2 great waves from the Met, those clouds are fine. So that's something also to keep in mind. Okay, so this print is an interesting print. I think this is the final print that we're going to talk about. One of the things, especially being a dealer, is, so we know that people made these little touched up areas, but also what happens is there's often restoration. And this print, right in the center of this print, there's clearly some really significant paper loss. And it has been repaired and touched in really, really very, very skillfully. And if that circled the back of the print where we see the bokashi around the Fuji, if we closely look at that, we see that there's actually a space between the black and the white part of Fuji, but in the front it's all black because in the front it's been touched in. Now that restoration to the naked eye, and also you can see here, the cloud is present but very faded. It's very, very difficult to see. Luckily they didn't put a fake cloud in. But the restoration, a lot of times, it's very difficult to see with the naked eye. This print I was able to see in person, but I was able to put a black light on it. And once I black lighted it, then it all fluoresced and you can see the difference of where it had all been touched in. So here you could see other close-ups of this if you look closely, where they used a single brush, very skillfully painted in that cartouche block. And you can see the reverse where it pooled from the ink because they're using a watercolor brush. So it's a tricky thing. One has to be a bit of a detective when you're looking at Japanese prints. And I think that's it for now on, let's see, yeah, that's about it for this section. Always to be continued. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Gary. I think the amateurs amongst us probably wouldn't go near one of these impressions without getting your advice. The conservation on these very valuable impressions is astonishing. Conservation is the wrong word. Enhancement, shall we say?
Yes.
Is a scary proposition. So now that we've looked at what can be done, I'd like to turn our attention to Sarah again and bring her back into the conversation. Armed with all this information, curious art lovers and aficionados may want to have a look themselves. And because of the global reach of the Great Wave, impressions can be found in institutions across the entire globe, and most especially in your own institution, the MFA. So Sarah, as the keeper of this enormous collection of Japanese prints and a curator of global exhibitions on ukiyo-e, in your opinion, what are the best known and best quality impressions that we're aware of extant today?
Oh, all right. Well, I wish I could say that the best are ours, but I'm afraid they're not. We do have some good ones, but we're not really in contention for the very tip-top best. But from my viewpoint, there's a consideration of what we can exhibit, what are the best things that we can show our audiences. So we have 7 impressions of the wave, and they split more or less half and half between things that we either do exhibit or would if we could. And here you see the ones that we would exhibit if we could. The one that I consider overall our best one is the one at the upper left. However, it is from a special collection, the famous Spalding collection that we were given in 1921 on the condition that it never be exhibited in the galleries in order to preserve the colors and keep them from fading. So it's a research collection. It can be photographed, it can be studied. You can make appointments to come and see it. But we are not allowed to exhibit it. So that is the one that I consider our best. And when I evaluate things, it's a kind of combination of the quality of the impression and also the condition. So even if something is a beautiful, beautiful impression with unbroken lines and so on, if it's dirty or discolored, then it's not going to look good up on the walls. So the best one we have that we can exhibit is number 2 at the upper right. That's from the Bigelow collection. It's a good one. I would give it an A-, but even in this not terribly high resolution photo, you can see there's some breaks in the lines. It's good, but not one of the really superb ones. We also have a good one, number 3, and that is actually a pretty good impression, but unfortunately it has some discoloring and some dirt. It belonged to a lady named Nellie Parney Carter, who apparently was the richest woman in Boston when she died in 1933. And the museum eventually got her a Japanese pit collection in 1934. Unfortunately, the wave was the prize of the collection, and it hung on the wall framed in her living room for many years. So it is not in such beautiful condition as we would ideally like, but we can and have exhibited it. Then number 4 is also quite a good impression. But that is from another special collection given by Denman Waldo Ross in 1906. We can exhibit it, but we may not loan it out to anyone except Harvard. Denman Waldo Ross was a professor at Harvard, so he would permit his gifts to the MFA to be exhibited either at the museum or at Harvard, but nowhere else. And again, according to Andreas Marx's study, that Ross collection print is actually the best impression. It's a little bit dirty, a little bit faded. The clouds are pretty much gone. So I would probably not consider it as good a thing to exhibit as the Bigelow print above it. But Marx has got 7 categories of, or I should be polite and say Andreas. I know him personally, and I shouldn't be calling him Marx, but he has 7 categories according to how much wear there is on the blocks, and that Ross print there at the bottom right falls into his category 2. And then the one that I've given the number 1 falls into his category 3. So alas, we do not have any of the ones that he thinks are in the very top category. I'll quickly show you the ones next that I think are interesting but unexhibitable. The 2 on the left are also from the Ross collection, obviously in bad condition. I even at one time considered getting rid of them because they meet our criteria for deaccessioning, which is they are duplicates in bad condition. However, I decided in the end not to, because it's awfully nice to be able to brag about having 7 great waves. So, the Met may have better ones than we do, but we have more of them. Then there is the last one of all, which is this very strange one with the fake cloud block. And in fact, it's got this very strange brown color on the boats and the clouds and so on. And it really almost looked like it's a fake print, but no, those blocks are bad, but it is very worn, a very worn original key block in there. So it's kind of a semi-fake. Maybe instead of saying we have 7, I should say we have 6.5. But there it is. And I'm embarrassed to say you can also find that one on a Uniqlo t-shirt. We let them do it on the grounds that after all, it was just a t-shirt, and they wanted it because it was a brown t-shirt and they actually liked the brown color for that purpose. So next slide, we move on beyond the MFA. I went to something I recommend very strongly if you don't know about it already, and that is the ukiyo-e search website. Perfectly wonderful website. You can search by images. Or you can search by words also if you're looking for the title of something. And then when they bring up the images, they very nicely give you this. I did not have to type that out. I just copied it from the website. And we have 7 according to that website. The Met has 4, the Tokyo National Museum has 4, and so on. So as I said, we win for quantity, but the Met ones are better. But of course, these are only the places that happen to have collections online. Not everyone does, or not everyone has given permission to be included in this search site. And so one very beautiful impression that I have seen in Japan is at the MOA Museum of Art in Atami. It's very, very nice. You can find it on their website. Unfortunately, it's not a high resolution image, so we really can't compare it to some of the others we've looked at. But I do want to mention that as one I think is particularly nice. And then finally, let's have the last slide. This is an exhibition I wish I had seen. It was just now in Japan. I would have liked very much to see it. But they compared 3 great waves from 3 different major collections in Japan. And probably the biggest in the world is the Japan Ukiyo-e Museum in Matsumoto. They think they have about 100,000 prints, which makes them roughly double our size. But we are the only one of the big collections that's actually counted. But I understand why other people have never gotten around to counting their collections, because it took us 6 years and quite a lot of grant money to do it. So I'm willing to take your word for it that the Japan Ukiyo-e Museum is bigger. Also, there are also very important collections at the Ota Memorial Museum in Tokyo, the Hiraki Ukiyo-e Foundation. And so for this exhibition, they had great waves from each of these major collections for you to compare. Again, they're not great photographs, so it was hard to come to a conclusion. I felt that they were good, but not outstanding. So in terms of what I personally know about, I would say the MOA Museum is probably the best one in Japan. But again, there are lots of things that haven't been published that are still out there that we don't know about yet.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, the elusive one that we're going to find in a hidden antique shop in the hills of Matsuyama or something. Hope springs eternal. But gosh, I wish I had seen this show too. I wonder what the attendance was in Japan this past summer. What a shame. What a great shame. And of course, when we get Andreas's books in our hands, we'll be able to make many, many more comparisons. Thank you. Michiko-san, working at the MFA, like Sarah, and having over 50,000 Japanese prints with multiple impressions of the same design with which to work and to make condition reports, what are some of the considerations that go into selecting the ideal impression for display of for a particular venue? And what role does conservation play in making that decision?
Yes, so conservators have to consider and balance a number of elements when selecting with the curator the best print to exhibit. Here are the 6 prints again from the MFA. And as you can quickly see, they are in varying condition, not just the wear in the block, print quality, color, but its physical condition. You ideally would want a print from an earlier printing that didn't come from a worn block, a good quality printing, well-preserved colors, and a print in good physical condition. As a conservator, we can't do anything about the quality of printing or the colors, but we can try to improve its physical condition so it's safe to display, but also possibly improve the legibility of the print. I must say we are very lucky to have 6 great waves, although some we wouldn't display, like Sarah said, due to its overall condition. But it allows us to see how the same print can differ from one another at its time of printing, but also how prints can be affected by time and wear. Now I'd like to show you the 6 great waves more up close. So this first print you can see has some damage, mainly on the surface, and the paper is discolored as well. There's wear in the block, and although the printing isn't terrible, due to the wear, the printing is lean in some areas. The dark gray in the boat near Mount Fuji is more like a blob, overpowering the key block printing below. There's a very faint pink sky, but the discoloration of the paper is obscuring what's left. The next print, this print, like the one before, also has some damage, mainly the large loss in the center near the bottom. The paper is also discolored, and you can see a large stain above Mount Fuji. This key block is also worn, and you can see the printing is overall lighter than the previous print. This print and the one before, we would most likely not exhibit. We're lucky enough to have other impressions, but if we only had either one of these, I would try my best to see what could be done to improve its physical condition and legibility. So this impression, the paper is still a bit discolored, but compared to the previous 2 prints, it's in much better condition, both in terms of color and physical condition. There's some unevenness in the right above the boat, but there aren't any major stability issues. The key block isn't as worn, so the printing is a bit better, although the black on the boat near Mount Fuji is still too dark, and in certain areas, the printing appears a bit uneven. But overall, this is a very is in good condition, and as Sarah said, we did actually show this recently. This print is also in good condition. There are some losses in the top corners, some dirt along the fold in the center, but overall its physical condition is good, and the printing is nice too. You can see there's a bit of misregistration, so you can see a gap near the outline of Mount Fuji in the sky, but the one big main issue is the color. It is quite faded. Yellow is hard to see. The gray sky was probably light to begin with, but the pink sky, although it's there, it's very hard to see. So although this is in good condition, this may be not something that we would like to display. Okay, and the last 2 are our best impressions, as Sarah mentioned. This print is in good physical condition. The key block is a bit worn. You can see the key block printing is a little bit heavy-handed. When you look at the tip of Mount Fuji, it isn't clear as the other impressions. The pink sky is there, but you really can't see that well. And then the last print, the colors are good. The yellow is visible in the boat. You see the pink sky is also there. The dark gray in the boat isn't completely obscuring the key block as well. The block may be a bit worn, again, if you look at the tip of Mount Fuji. But the print is in good physical condition as well. So overall, this is probably our best impression. Thank you.
Thank you, Michiko. I think that was a really good lesson in connoisseurship and how to judge other types of ukiyo-e prints as well. That a lot of those lessons can be applied across the board. Very insightful. So Gary, as an experienced dealer, you and I must be, like me, going crazy. What a plethora of riches to have 7 impressions in any one place.
I know, I only have like 6. Yeah.
It's like, very frustrating. But one who has worked for decades with auction houses, can you tell us a bit about the market history for the Great Wave? Impressions that have sold publicly, both in the 20th and 21st century, and give us some insight on how you might explain those prices in that context.
Okay, thank you, Joan. What I'm going to try to do is just give you a quick overview of the Great Wave sales at public auction, mostly in the United States. I mentioned one in London. Over the last 50 years, 51 years now, 52 years actually. So the first one, I'm going to sort of go quickly because it's getting late. The first one was sold at Park Burnett Galleries. It was the McFetridge sale, which had the Frank Lloyd Wright collection, some of the Frank Lloyd Wright prints in it. And that sold for $1,650. That was a lot of money. That was a lot of money in 1969. Prices at that point are starting to now get up there where people said, well, I think we could buy Japanese prints again and look to the future instead of the past. And so that was a lot of money, $1,650 in 1969. Moving on to 1974, the Vevey sale, Vevey 1. One sold for, now from 69 to 74, that's 5 years. The Vevey one sold for 5,000 pounds, about $7,000, which was a lot of money. And then we see in 1976 at Park Burnett in New York, we saw one from the Lewis Black collection, and that sold for $7,000. Just a quick side note, in 2018, a New York dealer sold that exact print for almost $600,000. Okay, that was in 2018. In 1979 at Sotheby Park Burnett, the Gaines sale, there was a very nice example, and that one went for $21,000, which was already a step up for 3 years before. Then in 1984, Christie's had a very nice example, and it sold for $45,000. Then in 86, there was one that was faded. It wasn't that great. It went for $26,000. Then in 1989, which is a very strong part in the Japanese print market in 1989, one went for $75,000, which was a lot of money, $75,000. Again, this isn't every print. This is an overview of just to give you an idea, but it's a lot of them. In 1992, Christie sold one for $70,000, and then in 2000, one went for almost $100,000, $99,500. In 2003, there was one that was a faded trim, not so good at all, and that one for $26,290 at Christie's. And then in 2009, one went for almost $70,000, $68,500. So that was 2009. The next print I'm going to talk about came up in 2017. So there weren't that many really nice ones and things in that period from 2009 to 2017 in general. This is at public auction. But in 2017, Christie sold one for almost $1 million, $943,500. It was a huge jump of things, even privately. privately, there were great waves being sold for about $400,000 at that period. This one going for almost $1 million. And it was a nice one. It was some fading, but it was a really nice impression. And it had no centerfold. So this was an interesting benchmark, because when something goes for that kind of money, things start coming out of the woodwork. So a landmark price for that, people started selling them. And between 2017 and 2020, one dealer sold 5 great waves for in that mid $400,000 to $600,000 range, far from that $1 million range. But because there were those more that were appearing on the market, again, supply and demand, we saw one that came up at Bonhams in 2019 that went for $475,000, and that was half. But it wasn't as good as the one that went for $1 million, but it's still, you see the price, coming down, supply and demand, the supplies are out there. And in 2019, Bonhams had just had one 6 months before, and then they had one they sold for $237,000. So it's going down because, well, they're out there, not as rare. It's interesting because that print was bought in 2005 by that collector, and they paid $67,000 in 2005, and they got $237,000 for it. The impression wasn't that great. It was faded. It had a centerfold on that print. And the interesting thing was, now we come to the print that we're looking at, which was the one that was sold at Christie's literally a few months later. And it was a similar kind of impression as the one at Bonhams, but it didn't have a centerfold. This one, Bonhams had a centerfold, and this impression is a little bit better. Color was sort of similar, but this one went for over $1.1 million, which was the record for a Japanese print. So in finishing up, it's hard to predict. You would think because those things had come up, you saw the prices drop, that maybe another one coming up, maybe it would have gone for like, 250, 300,000, 350 maybe. But 2 people wanted it, and they had the means, and that was the bottom line. 2 people wanted it, and the person who paid the most got it. So in closing, if you have a great wave, you have something that's worth a lot of money. So thank you, Joan.
Yes, keep it out of the sunlight.
Yeah, exactly.
My last question to a panelist is to Christine. And I would ask, in your research through the years, can you give us some examples, fun examples or otherwise, of how this iconic imagery has been repurposed by other cultures, and how the image is going to represent ideas very different from what Hokusai's original intent was?
Sure, it's hard to choose because there's so many of them. But let me give you 4 examples that give you some sense of the range of reinventions. This is one from the 19th century. And I chose it because it speaks very much to the importance of the reception of Japanese prints in Europe at the time. In Europe, the Great Wave motif was redeployed to express the artistic modernity that Japanese prints helped to provoke. And here we see the Great Wave quite literally overturning and engulfing traditional artistic norms that are symbolized by the easel, which you see falling overboard on the left. But this print also says more than its subject matter. This is a lithograph, and it's by Josso, and it's part of a series of lithographs called L'Estampe Originale, which was intended to make art more democratic by making it more accessible to the middle class through printmaking. So I think this is a very significant use of the wave in 19th century Europe. If we can move to the next one. The Great Wave has been used for political and social commentary, often in a very funny way, in a humorous way. And this is a t-shirt from the 1990s, which I have thanks to a colleague in California. And I love this t-shirt because, or excuse me, it's a sweatshirt, because it reminds the viewer that behind every great artist, there is a woman who carries out daily tasks like doing the laundry. One that can be rather threatening as we see this giant wave emerging from a top-loading washing machine. The Great Wave is an advertiser's dream. Yeah, you can go on to the next one. Thank you, Bonnie. An advertiser's dream. It's dramatic, it's oversized, it's in your face, and it can be put to so many different purposes. But I think one of the most unlikely I've ever seen is as a label for an Alsatian wine that was available at Trader Joe's about 15 years ago. And what has been done here, if you can look at the view on the right, is the Great Wave has been stretched upward and the boat and figure is not cutting through it, but is riding. So this sort of tipsy tall wave is used as a kind of play on tipsiness, but also to accentuate the verticality of the bottle. But obviously this is a kind, it's not an expensive wine. It's the kind of label that would grab your attention when it's on the shelf. Not only did whoever designed it use the wave, but they've also punned with another stereotype of Japan in labeling the wine now and zen. Obviously a play on now and then. The last use that I want to bring up is not a humorous one by any means. The Great Wave, and increasingly now, has been used for environmental causes. But this is a fairly early example from Gourmet magazine, I think in the 1990s. But it's a plea for clean water. But what I think is particularly striking about this particular advertisement is that it was sponsored by both Japanese and American organizations. And that serves as a reminder that environmentalism is a collaborative, transnational effort. And it also shows, I think, the way the Great Wave has become part of a shared global culture. So with that, I close. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Christine. Wow, very powerful image. Would be nice if they brought that back. I think we need more graphic images like that to inspire us. So in closing, I would like to ask our panel one quick question and just get a brief response from them as to, in a sentence or two at the most, could you give us your insights at what you think the biggest myths and misconceptions are regarding this iconic image? And I'd like to start with Sarah, since she's the one who set the stage for us initially.
Okay. I'm unmuted. Okay. Two of the biggest misconceptions that I get over and over and have to explain to people are first, a great deal of the general public is confused about the difference between a painting and a print. This is something that Christine touched on, but I often have to explain to people about the concept of multiple originals. There is no original of the Great Wave, insofar as there ever was one that presumably would have been Hokusai's drawing that was destroyed when they cut the blocks, and the point was to make multiples. So that's one misconception or misunderstanding. Another comment that people frequently made when they came to the Hokusai show and saw the whole series, including the Wave, was that it was much smaller than they expected. So, about 10 by 15 inches, about 2 sheets of typing paper side by side is how big it is. And people were surprised. Partly that's because it looms large. But I tried to explain that I think one reason it became so popular or became so well known is that it was small and therefore affordable. So many of them were made. Lots of people could afford to buy it, to have it, to pass it around. This is before the internet. You have to actually see the physical object, and if it's small and cheap, that helps.
Terrific. Great. I've had that myself as a dealer, where people are surprised how small ukiyo-e really is. They're so powerful and so graphic. Michiko, can you give us your thoughts on that question?
For me, it's really the pink sky, I think, because
Yeah.
although, like I said, I don't know how much brighter it would have been, I think it would have been very noticeable and a little bit more prominent. So I think people would have viewed it a little bit more differently. Yeah.
Terrific. And Matthew, I don't see your picture up here.
I'm here.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I would say that in response to your question, that the one of the bigger misconceptions that I consider about the Great Wave could be its originality. I'd like to temper that that concept, or that perception of the image, because we know that even within Hokusai's own career, he produced many images of waves, starting with the series that Sarah showed us. I think there's one in that group, even printed in blue, as well as the images from the 100 Views of Mount Fuji, which he has that dramatic image of waves turning into plovers that Christine showed us. And beyond that, of course, are the just generations and generations and centuries of images of the sea and images of waves that precede it. I always start my survey classes, when I teach them, with you'll usually have a couple of ceramics, and then I'll show a couple of paintings, and I might put in an image of the Great Wave, because that's the one thing that students probably would come to such a class expecting to see. And I usually manage to get to Hokusai. Sometimes I get a little bit further, but I find it really interesting to see how they themselves, these younger budding students of Asian art, start to unpack the image and see different things in it. And one of the things that they often comment on is that they've been sort of prepped to see this, is the low horizon, and to see how different that is. The low horizon, literally, as we would call landscape format of the landscape, which in East Asian painting is new in the Edo period. Typically, landscapes are vertical. And so we ourselves, as Westerners, back in the 19th century, were also prepared for seeing the Great Wave when it was produced. All of the prompts that appeal to our own visual sensibilities of low horizons, fairly clear perspective relationships, and even color, I think are all provided for us. And that's part of what makes it so, I think, appealing to Western audiences, maybe more than the red Fuji, which is my personal favorite.
Very classic Japanese taste. Thank you. And it must be interesting semester after semester, encountering young people and seeing their responses to something that is now old hat to you, but with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
And educating those eyes to something else. Thank you, Matthew. And finally, Gary, you got the last comment to make. What would you like to add to the myths, which obviously are long and storied when it comes to connoisseurship and value? What would you like to tell us?
So probably what relates to this talk about sort of myths and things that might not be obvious are so many people say, even in the field, when they look at the Great Wave, so many times it's not what it looked like when it was just printed. As we spoke about, sometimes they've been touched in with color and made the impressions to be look better with touching in on the key blocks. So it's hard a lot of times to see a pure, what we call innocent one. And it's sort of funny, you know, when people looking at it and they go, oh, that's great. You know, especially like at the Met, wow, isn't that wonderful? Well, that's not what it looked like when it was printed. You know, somebody took it upon themselves to edit that. So that's sort of interesting. It's just a little ditty.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Joan.
Christine, I didn't mean to skip you, but being the one who looks at this on a global stage rather than the microscope of Japanese art, what would you think of as the most pervasive myths regarding this image?
Well, I think I would single out just one, and that is that that it represented a tsunami. And I don't think that that would have been Hokusai's intent. In fact, I'm quite sure it would not have been Hokusai's intent, because it would have been an inauspicious subject. And the print was issued as part of a series that was celebratory. So it would hardly have been appropriate to have it represent a tsunami. But today, that is very much how it's understood, particularly outside of Japan.
On that auspicious note, thank you to our panelists and all their hard work. I'm sorry we've run late, but I have to say you've stuck with us, and it's been great having you here to share all these insights from our marvelous speakers and really perceptive connoisseurs of Japanese art. Our next event will be the Winter Antique Show, the Winter Show, where we're doing a show on porcelain. And our next panel discussion will be, believe it or not, on the world of American ceramics with Jeff Shapiro, who studied in Bizen for many years. And then this will be followed in March by our Asia Week programming. And of course, there'll be a great deal of Asia Week programming on a multiplicity of topics and subjects across the Asian art platform. And so stay tuned for all of that. Thank you for being with us. Please stay safe. Please stay well, and be with us in the future. We're on the home stretch, and hopefully the next time we meet, things will be better in this country, and we will have turned the real 21st 2021 page to a better time. And thank you all for being here. Good night.
Thanks, Joan.